Good morning. Let's open up to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. It's good to see everyone. We've been making our way through Paul's letter to the church at Philippi. At this point, what has he said? Well, he said that he has a great love for them. That's very clear through this letter. We've heard that he prays for them, that we hear that he prays for their spiritual growth in particular. We hear about his imprisonment and how it's actually worked out for the better, and how it gave other Christians confidence to be bold to spread the gospel. We talked about him and his thoughts on life. Should I go or should I stay? To live as Christ, to die is gain. But I'm going to stay here on your behalf. And he talks about Jesus Christ being the prime example of unity and love for one another, and in particular, humility. And we talked about that last week. And so at one point, he says, every knee will bow and confess the name Jesus Christ. And he continues on. We are in Philippians chapter 2, and I'm reading verses 12 and 13. Philippians 2, 12 and 13. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So first of all, just kind of take that in, hear it. But there are certain concepts, ideas, there are terms that he uses, and he doesn't use them in vain. He's communicating certain ideas. And I want to focus on some of these. He talks about obedience. Jesus Christ was not exempt from being obedient. You remember the Hebrew writer, he's going to talk about the superiority of Jesus Christ. He's going to get into his priesthood, but he talks about although he was the Son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation. He is the source of eternal salvation to what? Well, to all who obey him. There it is. Paul, in his introduction, he gives this beautiful introduction to the saints in Rome. And Jesus Christ, the resurrected Jesus Christ, is who he's talking about, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations. I want to say this just really quickly. I've said it before, but the Bible, when it talks about faith, it can talk about it in an objective way or in a subjective way. And he's talking about the objective faith. Do you know that you could, in other words, do you know it is correct to say that a person can obey the faith? You're like, how can someone obey my belief? Well, because he's talking about objective faith. The truth, the unchanging truth of who Jesus is, what he came to do, his lordship over his kingdom and his expectation. Those laws, is it okay to say law? Yes. That is an objective truth. And Paul says, you know what we're about? We're about bringing the obedience of objective faith. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. By the way, a side note, always pick up how the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are brought into these passages. Don't skip by them. It shows how the Godhead works together. The foreknowledge of God the Father and the sanctification of the Spirit. The Spirit sanctifies us. It's a process in which he continues to separate us. We're not of the world. For obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. Obedience. Hold on to this. He also talks about, so now not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation. Yes, you have a part to play. Whenever Peter preaches Jesus Christ crucified, you killed the Holy One. He continued to exhort them. You see this in Acts 2. And Peter said, save yourselves from this crooked generation. So, generally speaking, I'm preaching about what I'm seeing. I got my little neck of the woods, so do you. We're all kind of in it together, right? And in my limited time and involvement, here's something that I've seen over the past 10 to 12 years. That in the body, many times, we struggle feeling secure in our salvation because we have the wrong kind of fear. We have a misunderstanding of who God is. Now, there is a time to fear, and there's a time to tremble. Side note, this may or may not shock you, but that fear, if you're going to be a geek about it and go to the Greek, that's the sense of that fear is reverence. It's not being afraid of. It's reverence. But reverence has the idea of it's such reverence that it borders fear, trembling, but it's not. But he also uses the word trembling. Sometimes whenever you're writing to Christians, you got people in all walks of life, and some people need to always continue to keep that reverence, but some people need to tremble. Some people need to tremble because they're out of step. But he says, work out your own salvation. Okay. In the church, though, many times we struggle with feeling secure in our salvation. And so I have found myself talking a lot about this, and I make no apologies. But at the same time, I let Paul take the lead, and I'm trying to be more like guys like Paul. And Paul would speak so much about the grace of Jesus Christ. He would speak so strongly about it. Do you remember in Romans 5, that when he talks about, sin's just piling up and grace abounds all the more? What then? Romans chapter 6, verse 1. Shall we sin that grace may abound? No doubt, he says, is what you're going to see. Hey, if whenever I sin, by God in his goodness forgives me, and it really makes God look wonderful, then maybe I'll just keep on throwing him some sin bones and make him just look great. And he says, God forbid that. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is that I am aware of myself, and I know that I talk a lot about salvation in Jesus Christ and feeling secure. But brethren, what I am not saying is that sin is a little thing. Yes, I think a person can overemphasize obedience to where they begin to sound like it's merited salvation, but you can also forget to talk about the word obedience, and you get people that are lackadaisical and begin to trample over our Lord. We are supposed to be obedient to God. Well, what do you mean? Well, what do you think that means? It means obedient to him. I'll say this last thing, and then I'll move on. There is no one living today who sincerely loves Jesus but does not obey him. That does not exist. So there it is. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. He says, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Hebrew writer, Hebrew 13, said, now may the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant, equip you with everything good that you may do his will, working in us that which is pleasing in his sight, through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. Paul wrote to the saints in Corinth, and he'd been referenced the other apostles, then said, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. He talked about how he had been put to work. He talked about how he'd been against the cause, but God shows him grace. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Here's another beautiful truth in this kingdom. That God, and we talk about this a lot, and I think we always need to be mindful of this, is working in you. To his glory. He works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Now that's critical. Paul, writing to Timothy, said, "Now in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honorable use, some for dishonorable. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable," so that's our part, "he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work." See, the reality is that God uses every vessel. But you get to play a part into what kind of vessel you wanted to be used as. But make no mistake, you are being used by Him, for Him, to His glory. So there are two things, and I want to quickly mention this and we'll move on. Two things that we need to watch in the local body. One, here are the two extremes. You're trying to encourage people to be zealous for good works. Know what it is that God has equipped you with and get to work. So that's one extreme where you got people that don't want to do anything. I'm just speaking very, very bluntly right now. The other extreme is people that totally know what they're doing and they like everyone to know what they're doing and they think way, way, way too highly about themselves or other people and they're braggadocious. Two extremes that we need to check. You get to work because God has given you the ability and it is for His glory. Yeah, we know that. Well, then why do bodies struggle with it so much? Okay? Now listen to this. He says, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith." Very beautiful picture too, isn't it? That's a really beautiful picture. "I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me." Okay, listen, here's a challenge for the week. I'm hitting a lot of different things. The nature of doing these book studies is that there's several topics. This is why I love book studies. You want a passage on obedience? Someone says, "I don't think you get caught too much up on obedience to Jesus Christ." Did this help you already? Here's a passage. You don't tell me you've forgotten already. We just talked about it. Talk about not, being without spot, blemish, grumbling, disputing. Here's one challenge out of all these things that I'm going to say this morning in the next few minutes. If you want to join me in this one, I'm going to join you this week. No grumbling this week, no disputing. I knew one minister that used to preach in the area. He taught on complaining, and it was really cool. He made everyone little rubber bracelets. He paid for them and handed them all out about no complaining. I want you wearing this week. It's not leaving you. I love that. I'd buy it for you guys, but I'm cheap and I don't like you that much. Grumbling. I'm kidding. You know that. Grumbling, complaining, or murmuring. I actually wanted to include the definition on these because it kind of hits home whenever you read it. Utterance made in a low tone of voice. It's got that murmuring, right? The context indicates whether the utterance is of one of discontent or satisfaction. So, again, that word can be used in a certain context where it's in the positive, but this is in the negative. Okay, you ready for this one? Behind the scenes talk. Any of you just going, move along. Yeah. Behind the scenes talk. Negative aspect. Complaint, displeasure, expressed in murmuring. Peter says, listen, this life that you're living among the Gentiles and this love that you do in serving one another, he says, do it without complaining. I'll just say, that's 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7 through 11. It's the little things that'll rip a congregation up. Behind the scenes talk. Whenever you're really getting somewhere with the local group, whenever you're coming to a place where you can have difficult discussions with one another and not have to worry about behind the scenes talk. But it's not easy. It's not easy because we're people. I mean, that's the reality. It's not easy. I failed at it. Have you failed at it? And also disputing. Verbal exchange that takes place when conflicting ideas are expressed. Dispute, argument. Now, please, you understand that whenever you're looking at these terms, whenever you isolate themselves on their own, you can come away with the wrong idea. That means you should never dispute. Well, then you're going to have a hard time explaining a lot of New Testament passages where Jesus and godly men were disputing. Is it wrong to ever have a complaint about something? No. So then what are we talking about? It's the context. It's that negative. It's not a complaint in order to actually get somewhere. It's just never satisfied, complaining, causing divisions, blah, blah, blah. Arguing, disputing over what? Over what? And we do these kinds of things. We got to be careful about it. I wanted in particular to include Luke 9:46 because it uses that Greek term, and it's actually, I think this hits close to home. An argument arose among them as to which of them was the greatest. I wonder if that's why we dispute sometimes among ourselves, because we can't get over ourselves. Yeah? 1 Timothy 2:8. Now here's a refreshing idea. When we come together and we worship God, I desire that in every place that men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Imagine the idea. Well, Paul says, no, don't imagine it, make it happen. Whenever you come together and you lift holy hands without quarreling and without anger, right? That's why Jesus says, listen, if there's an issue, leave your gifts at the altar and go make it right. Okay? Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. That's why I titled this Lights. That's who we are. There's the dark and there's the light. The world has perfected grumbling and disputing. Would you agree with that? And here's the thing. If the world didn't have something to grumble about, to complain about, they would have just found their complaint. We just like it. We are supposed to be the total opposite of this. We are really supposed to be a blessing in someone's life. You know, in Deuteronomy 32, I'm not going to read it, but whenever you look at that context, what ends up happening is that Moses knows, this is actually going to be in Deuteronomy 31 at the tail end, that he knows that after his departure, once he's not there, you know, Paul says to work out your salvation with fear and trembling whenever I don't have to be there. We have that's kind of another tricky thing. We tend to be a certain way whenever the right people are around, and then when we're gone, we act something different. And what Moses is saying is that I know that after my departure, you are going to be evil because you're evil right now. Now again, remember I talked about context? This is not at you. But what ends up happening is that he praises God in this song, and then he talks about how God's people had become a crooked and twisted generation. We're not supposed to be that. Jude 24, now to him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you blameless before the presence of his glory with great joy. I like this passage because I need to be remembered that although I do stumble, and maybe I'm making too much out of this, but stumbling to me is different than falling. But I'm also reminded that even then, God has given the direction and the power to even keep me from stumbling. Like when we're talking about being without blemish, like, well, to what degree? Well, he can keep you from every degree. Without blemish. Just because we struggle, I've got this fly that's going to get me. I'm going to judo chop that thing. Just because, I'm sorry. Just because we struggle doesn't mean that we give up the fight. We strive for perfection. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and give glory on the day of visitation. You're going to get tired of me referencing, I'm going through this book right now. I can't get it out of my head. Y'all, this book that's talking about these early Christians, I'm rethinking my entertainment now. And I felt good about it. I don't listen to bad language. To me, that should be a given. Are any of you listening to bad language? If you're watching a show with bad language, what are you doing, right? We try to, and And I'm saying, I understand that sometimes there can be a word here or there. You know what I'm talking about. I mean, I've got stuff, apps. If I can't filter that stuff out, we're not listening to it. I thought we were past that. No, we don't watch nudity. Really? Are we talking about that? Listen, if you're doing that, I love you, but come on. Come on. Just let me say that as a straight your brother. Come on. You don't need to sit down. Do we need to have a 45-minute Bible study about that? You know you're doing wrong. Cut it out. Don't let that break you down and be like, oh, I'm a horrible individual. No, just cut it out. Cleanse yourself. But now I'm reading what they were doing 2,000 years ago, and I'm feeling pretty good and feeling pretty balanced, and now I'm going, ugh. I would look at it and be like, there's no language, there's nothing in there. And it's like, well, was that a premarital relationship in that story there? Well, yeah, but I mean, interesting. Their entertainment, they were having no part of it. Immodesty, behaving in certain ways, acting out certain ways, wouldn't do it. Read of an account where one guy in his profession, because of the culture, it was inappropriate. And so he quit his profession. And he asked this church, well, what if I just teach it? And they said, if it's not right to do it, it's not good to teach it. But you know what the church also did? They said, but since that was your main income, if you can't pay the bills, then we'll support you until you can find an income. They were serious about being without blemish. Christians long ago were going against the current, or the culture current. One of the things that this guy says in his book, and it's making me think, and when you read it, it's like you've always known this, but I thought it was on point. He said his fear is that what you have is you have Christians today, and we tend to group and surround ourselves with people that, generally speaking, think the same thing we do. They have generally the same religious beliefs. They generally will even vote for the same guy. That kind of thing will happen. But his fear, he says, is that their standard no longer is Jesus, but what the conservative group accepts. So, for example, all of us are still against abortion. That's never changed. Check, we feel good there. But what about divorce? Well, back in the day, the conservative group would say that's inappropriate for children of God. But today, it's kind of like, well, but he'll forgive you. And so now our standard is not on Jesus, but on this conservative culture. Does that kind of resonate with you? All I'm going to say is that Christian culture back in the day, they weren't legalistic. They weren't trying to earn their salvation. They were moved by the grace of God and did not want to be known to be part of the Roman society. And the Romans were taking note of it. And they said, these people are oddballs. And you know what the reality is? Sometimes I don't want to be an oddball. I wonder if sometimes we blend in too much. I'm thinking through this. I want you to join me in this. Okay? He says that he wants to be proud that he did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with you all. Kind of like something being offered, sacrifice. He said, even if I'm offered a sacrifice on your behalf, that's great. But I don't want this to be in vain. We understand what he means. He's not saying that whether they continue in the faith or not, whether people obey the faith or not, that his labor had no value. But he's just saying, I don't want this to be in vain at the day of Christ. And brethren, all I'll say is that, what's the point of starting a race if we're not going to finish it, right? So again, for Christians, we have that mentality that we're going to start what we're finished with the help of the Lord. It's just not even an option in our mind to stop running. Sacrifice, this picture of sacrifice. A really quick comment on this one. If you're like me, I sometimes find myself trying to live the Christian life, which is centered around the concept of sacrifice, trying to live the life without inconveniencing myself. Just a quick reminder. At what point, Sean, whenever you decided to carry that cross, did you begin to ask for shoulder pads? You know? That's something I got to ask. I invite you to ask these questions with me. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with the Father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me, and I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. Of course, Timothy, you know this young man, began to join Paul in his travels. He meant so much to him. And just a quick reminder, brethren, if we're going to be lights in the world, if we're going to shine and be a help to the world, we cannot do that until we first get our own house in order. It makes no sense to invite people into a dysfunctional home. So if we want to love and be a light to each other, to the world, it starts with us. Epaphroditus, I have thought it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy, and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. So Timothy, you know a lot about. We'll read about him. Epaphroditus, we don't know a lot about him. All that we know about Epaphroditus is in Philippi. We know that he was one of them. He was one of their servants. We learned in chapter 4 that he came giving a gift, so they were supporting. And so what happened was they sent Epaphroditus to Paul to give this gift, but he was going to remain with him and labor with him and tend to his needs, whatever he had. Well, what ended up happening is that he guys get homesick and he becomes very ill, even to the point of death. The brethren at Philippi hear about this. They're greatly distressed. Epaphroditus is greatly distressed. Now, Paul is greatly distressed about this whole thing. Side note, by the way, interesting. Isn't it interesting that Paul didn't heal Epaphroditus? Just chew on that one. They weren't just using these miraculous abilities. I mean, it's kind of interesting there, right? So here he was very ill, and what he's saying is that I'm going to send him back to you. This love and this connection that they had with one another is to be admired. And so what Paul has done now in this letter is that, of course, he talked about his life, but he centered the main example on Jesus, on love and humility and oneness, and now he's given the example of Timothy, and he's also now given the example of Epaphroditus. And my closing remark to this, and I appreciate so much your attention. I hope this has been an encouragement to you. And again, before I forget, if you're up for the challenge, no complaining, no murmuring this week. Let's see how that goes. I know that these men did big things, okay? Timothy did big things. Epaphroditus did big things. And you look at yourself and you go, what am I doing? Jordan and I were talking in the car yesterday. When you think about it, I don't know. I'm just throwing out a statistic as if I know what I'm talking about. 80% of the world, most of us grow up in a certain place, don't live tons of different places. Most of us will stay within one state. I mean, if you move to multiple states in the U.S., we're like, you're the most cultured person I've ever seen in my life. Most of us live in like a state or two. We lived in so many towns. A few of them we stayed the majority of the time. We've only known so many people. We've only, for a long period of time, worshiped with so many people. You've only worked at so many jobs where you've put in 5, 10 plus years. You have a very limited experience of this world. I have a very limited experience in this world. What could we do? What impact could we have? And I started thinking, that's the story of most people in the world. And it is through that scenario that Jesus Christ continues to turn the world upside down. It is in your little slice of pie, the people that you meet, the people that you love, the people that you shine around, you're going, this isn't doing anything. This is exactly how it's done. It's exactly how it's done. So be encouraged. Remember, Jesus in Matthew 25 gives that situation, separating the sheep and the goats. What kind of people, Jesus, do you want to be with for all eternity? Oh, people that could give a cup of cold water. So give a cup of cold water this week. May God bless you.